Hi there. The Dungeon Master Roundtable you're about to watch is just one of a few topics that were covered during a live stream on the Dicely DnD Twitch channel. And the music you'll hear during this video was created by Tabletop Audio. And now I'll let our guests introduce themselves.
Hello, I am Juce from Master the Game RPG on YouTube. You can check me out. We make all sorts of tabletop RPG content, Dungeons and Dragons, Fantasy Age, you name it. Palladium books is something I'm known for by that community. So yeah, head on over there if you want reviews, opinion videos, live plays, all that good stuff.
My name is Crowe. I run the YouTube channel, the Crow's Perch, where I cover a bunch of D&D horror stories and other stories like that. I just like narrating other people's stuff because I like telling stories, and stories are fun. And that's why I like playing things like D&D. And you can catch my channel over on YouTube/Crow's Perch. I also have a Discord. And I recently have little merch, so I got little A do murder. I'm a cartoon bird on the internet. How do you do?
Hey, I'm Kevin, also known as KR King. My channel is D&D Homebrew. I specialize in homebrewing your own world, creating a entire campaign setting from start to finish. That's kind of what I've always done. I played since the old days. I really like to help people to create their own worlds, but I also analyze modules and different campaign settings, trying to get some of the stuff out of there that you can use in your own world.
Hey folks, Wally DM here. I have a YouTube channel that's focused on puzzles and traps and wrote a book about it.
My name is Fred Wheeler. I run the How to D&D YouTube channel. I talk about Dungeons and Dragons and RPGs, and I'm the one who herds the cattle or the sheep or the cats or whatever it is into these things. Dungeon Master Roundtable things.
Thank you all. This has been a great conversation evening so far. So the next question we have coming up here is, how would you facilitate or deal with the all-seeing eyes? Which is what I call it when a player character has a passive perception higher than 20. Now, this isn't really, something to be mad about on the DM side, I think, because it's within the rules for the player to get there. I'm sure this might bring up emotions in DMs.
I feel like Juice has some things to say about it.
And there's a part of me that's tempted. Should we start with Juice or should we start with Fred?
Make him wait. Oh my goodness!
You gonna make him wait? That's fucked up.
Oh, Fred doesn't look like he has an answer ready.
Don't start with Juice and don't start with me. and
Kevin!
Both of us have got to shut up so the rest of them can actually say something. I will say nothing until you say it's my turn to speak. Juice, you've got to do the same. Otherwise, I know what's going to happen.
Whew. All right, perhaps then we'll start with Kevin. Go for a happy split.
Well, this is interesting. Now I'm all like, what are they going to say? And
right?
I can tell they don't like this. So the thing about this question is, as you mentioned, if someone... depending on how you create characters, you do a point-buy system or roll or however you do this, and someone creates a character to get a high passive perception, that's what they have, right? So are you going to punish them? Are you going to be mad? Now, I'm not a fan, and you guys might be, the feat system, because if you have, I think it's that observant feat, then things start to turn into, to me, ridiculousness, right? In terms of, well, I shouldn't say ridiculous. I'll let those guys comment on that, because... but obviously, you're getting in these situations, and what is passive perception, right? What is it that they notice? Well, and let's just say you have creatures with a good stealth, or goblins, let's say, that are going to ambush a party, and someone comes along with a 25 passive perception, and they say, well, there's no way. Did you roll? How could they be? They have a +6, I think. So even the 25 with their stealth. Couldn't you have goblins that this is their area that they live. This is where they know. This is where they do ambushes. And they set it up in such a way that they have a much higher sort of stealth, or it's much more difficult. And you get players that play the numbers game that are just like, but I have this high passive perception. Don't I get this? Don't I have this? And again, you're not trying to, fudge the rolls. You're not trying to give, so I got the one guy with the 25 passive perception, so I'll make these goblins +8 to, stuff. You're not doing that, but you're saying that there are situations where people are in such a situation, they're really accustomed to their area, they really are good at something, that that role isn't just going to overwhelm the game. So that's kind of I think I will take a short version of this and that's my piece. You can't punish people if you're playing that game. Again, the feat thing, no, I don't like that. But if they just roll up their character and this is their class and they have the wisdom, as their, blah, blah, blah. We all know those people that do this because they never want to be surprised, right? And being surprised sucks. And that, they're giving up other things. They're giving up other abilities. So that's my very short take on this. And we can move on to the people that are maybe a little more passionate.
Fantastic. You know what? We're going to do this in an interesting order because we seem to have such passion here. We're going to go Wally next and then to Jacob, and then I'm going to go, and we're going to leave Juice and Fred for the end here. Okay. So, Wally, if you want to go ahead.
Get back to them.
Yeah.
We'll just let them stew.
Thank you for being here. We're not going to listen to you.
I have a very troubled past with passive perception.
As a guy with traps, that makes absolute sense.
Yes, absolutely. With traps and puzzles, I've eliminated it from my game. I've included it in my game just to eliminate it again. So what I've done is I've kind of thrown out the rule book, and I've kind of I do with passive perception what I want to do with it, and that is I will use stealth rolls against it. Like Kevin was talking about goblins and stuff, I would have the goblins roll stealth and I would put it against passive perception. And I will use passive perception to give away hints that I want. But I have also made the definition or I have distinguished a difference between passive perception and active perception. And if someone is actively looking for something, they will have to make a perception roll, which shouldn't be too big of a deal. If you've got a massive passive, then you've probably got a really good modifier to your active perception. So it shouldn't be that big of a deal. I still get folks, though, when I do play, be like, when I do ask for an active perception roll, be like, I rolled an 8 total. Maybe they rolled a 2 and plus 6. But my passive is 15. Can I just use that? I'm like, no. The way that I'm running it now is passive perceptions for me. It's not for you. I deal with that behind the scenes. This shield is what I deal with passive perception. That's for stealth rolls. That's for stuff that you just notice. Your spidey senses is so many people. So that it took me a very long. I've been playing 5e for 5 years. It took me a very long time, but I feel comfortable with this. I know it's not RAW, but it's it is RAW. It's rules as Wally. And that's the way I like it. So with regards to someone having an insane high passive perception, and I'm dealing with this in my home game, I'm finally getting to play with my brother again. This is my first campaign with him in several years, and he has a gnome that already has passive perception of 17. We've hit recent level 4. He's taken the observant feat. He wants to be a linguist. He wants to be able to do all of these languages. He wants to be able to read lips, and he likes that passive perception. And so what I do is I include things in my game. So when they come into a room or into a situation, I describe the room or situation, and I always include one extra thing that person recognizes. Be like, okay, this is the setup. You walk into this room, there's a bunch of books around, and you've got a person sitting in a rocking chair. And then I'll look at that person and be like, but you notice this. And I throw that bone out every time. Every time I think that this is a good situation, I throw a clue out there, and I let them do with it as you will. You're giving them, and a lot of times I will say, I'll be like, okay, I think his character's name is Brock. I'll be like, okay, Brock, with your high passive perception, you notice this. It looks like maybe there might be something behind something. And I think that solves that perfectly. Always be sure that if you have somebody that wants to specialize in having a high passive perception and take the observant feat and things like that, especially with observant feat, give them the chance to read lips. You're in a bar, be like, with your passive perception, hey, by the way, your character notices and you read their lips for just a second and you think that there's something going on. It's no big deal to just make sure. When I used to play D&D, I would write down each character's name and I would put their armor class and hit points and I would track that. I've X'd that out. I let them take care of that. Now I put their names down. I know what languages they speak, and I know what their passive perception is because they've worked on that, and I try to include that to the best of my ability to where I, as a dungeon master, feel comfortable.
Wow. Yeah, that's it. I mean, it doesn't surprise me based on like your specialization on traps and such that you would have put a lot of thought into this, and I think there's a lot of wisdom there to be taken away on the subject. Furthermore, during your discussion, I think I'm going to allow Fred and Juice to go before myself in this because I feel like I might have a nice cherry to add to the top of this. Now I see you shaking your
You've got to
head,
bring
Fred,
it together.
but for now, we're going to move on to Jacob.
All right. When I saw this question, I actually wrote something down for this. Let me go back. So, when it comes to passive perception, I used to mess around with it a lot. Ever since I first started running 5e, like even way back during like fucking basic rules and whatnot. I don't use it anymore. I really don't. After playing through and reading through Gumshoe, if any of you are familiar with that game, my school of thought has always been to give the players the most important information. And when it comes to how they act with it, that's up to their discretion. Like, I want to give you what's in the room, even if it's basic descriptions of what those things might be. And I think there are still ways, and there have been ways that have implemented traps while still giving you what's in the room, what's it look like. I might not tell you where the monster is, but I might give you signs that it might be there. I can just tell you there's a treasure chest. It seems to be covered in like a thin film. You go up to it, and you say, I'm going to try to touch it, and it's your fault if the mimic bites your hand off. You know, but at the end of the day, like, I've kind of switched to this other school of thought when it comes to this kind of stuff, because I really liked what I saw in Gumshoe. Like, the way that game works is it's an investigation game, and you don't roll for clues. All clues are given to you. And that doesn't mean every lead is going to take you to where you're going, you know, the conclusion of who did the murder or who done it, you know, or whatever. But it gives you something to work with. There's always something to work with, even if it's wrong. You know, even if looks can be deceiving, even if, you know, this smell makes you think it's this particular chemical, and then you go and find out and it turns out it's this other fucking thing, you were completely wrong. But if I give you all the information, you have the freedom to succeed and you have the freedom to fail there. So that's how I treat passive perception. I just tell you what's in the room.
I like that, man. It's almost like you went a little bit old school on us. I appreciate that.
Definitely.
You
I
describe the
pull a lot
room,
from
and
the
they
OSR
do
stuff.
with it what they do with it. Very good.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a lot of players nowadays, you know, you start describing a room, and then they jump to, oh, what is that? And it's like, well, I wasn't done with the room yet.
That's why you keep your descriptions really short.
Yeah, you gotta go brief.
Because that's the thing, too. I don't want to fucking tell you a whole, like, novel. I used to do that, too, back in the day. And it's just, no. I want you to do things. And I want to put you in a position to give you as much actionable information as possible. I am not here to tell you my graphic novel. I'm not here to give you the script to my, you know, what is the phrase, that word that means like my grand piece of art? I don't know why I'm missing the word for it right
opus
now.
magnum opus.
Magnum opus, yes. I'm not here to give you the magnum opus of my grand script that I'm hoping one day to show Steven Spielberg. I don't care. I want to give you actionable information, and I want to give it to you quickly and cleanly. And if you want anything else, inspect things, touch things, move things around, find out what happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well done.
Well, so Juice and Fred, we do have a way to figure out which of you is going to go next. And what we're going to do is I'm going to and Juice just wants to give it up to Fred, which makes it very unfortunate because we were just about to do something very fun. Dang it. I was just going to have you guys write exclamation D20 in the chat. You would roll a D20 to see who goes next.
Let's do it.
Maybe they should check their passive.
I'll still do that.
Do it. Exclamation D20. Type that in the Twitch chat. We'll see what you roll. Why aren't you working, D20? Oh, there we go. Well, Juice got a crit. Do you want to go first, Juice? Okay.
He points to Fred.
He gives it to Fred then. Very well.
Kick or receive.
All right, Fred,
Okay.
you're next.
So I think the first thing I want to say, and a lot of people have argued with me about this, so let's just get it real. This is just how over the many years I've been using passive perception in 5e, but I also played 4e. So we had essentially passive perception there, and passive perception is something that's been pulled from 3.5, which was called the taking 10. We had taking 20 and taking 10. So they're very, very similar in many aspects, and they have sort of evolved over time. And so I don't really care what you guys do at your table. I'm only going to explain what the journey was for me. First thing you've got to realize that I realized, and that is, initially you think like it's something that you can just figure out by looking at the rule book. But actually perception and the interplay of that with stealth and invisibility and all those other things, it's so complicated, and it's so dependent on a supercomputer to make and process and figure out how to work that given the situations. And that supercomputer is the Dungeon Master brain. That's why you have the Dungeon Master in the first place. Now the designers actually understood that initially when they put the game out. And if you look in the book, it does actually pretty much almost state that passive checks is very much a Dungeon Master tool. So you can apply passive checks to passive perception, something else. So whether the Dungeon Master uses it or doesn't use it, or how they use it, there's actually a couple of different things provided here, and they don't have to use it exactly that way. I think the problem is that if in the player's handbook they had written just above it optional rule for the Dungeon Master rather than optional rule, or should I say baked in rule that the players get to use, then the issues would have been a lot easier to deal with. So high passive perception is something that I dealt with early on, and my first response was I did nothing. And I did nothing because I didn't know what to do with it, because I hadn't taken ownership of the passive perception mechanic, because I was just doing what I thought I was supposed to do, and even though I'd had interplay with the alpha play test, that didn't help me. So one of the things that I found is, high passive perception doesn't really matter if you're dealing with a monster that has false appearance. So when you have a monster that has false appearance, there's nothing to actually see. There's nothing to smell. There's nothing to, you might smell it. You might hear it, I suppose. It's possible, because perception covers a lot of different things. But the reality is that passive perception just may not help, because that monster doesn't give itself away because of that special feature. It's there, it's deliberately put there. The only way that monster works is because it is an ambush monster, which is why it has false appearance. And it also makes sense for that monster. The other thing is, I decided that I did not like the observant feat in the game. It's there, and then we're told that feats are optional, but the reality is, if you're playing Adventurers League, when I was running Adventurers League, I did not have a choice. I had to deal with the observant feat. When I run my own games, I would prefer that players don't take the observant feat. And in my home game, they do ask me, look, do you mind if I take the observant feat? Because I know what that's going to do. Because everybody in my group are Dungeon Masters as well. They're not just players, they'll be all Dungeon Master. We take turns. So for me, I think the problem is that the feats should have gone into the Dungeon Master guide rather than to the player's handbook, to actually say it is actually a variant rule, because actually it's not a variant rule in reality when you do it that way. And the observant feat is one of those things that's just so good, like the alert feat, that it's a no-brainer to not take it, because the super skill in Dungeons and Dragons, if that's what you're going to do and rely on making a check, is perception. So passive perception, you want to fall back on that. It's consistent. You don't have to roll. I hate rolling dice. I could roll a 1, I could roll a 20, but passive perception, it's always a static number. That's something you can rely on. So as a player, I understand that they want that, but there are some problems with that because you need that variability in it. So for me, every opportunity I can get rid of the observant feat, I do. Okay, because it does break down the game. I think the other thing is, a lot of people, when they look at passive perception, they're thinking, well, all I need to do is roll a dice. But one of the things the designers did say, and I think a lot of people forget this, is you need to manipulate your environment. I like it when my players say, I pull on the book the books in the bookshelf to see if there's a secret door that slides open, rather than I look for secret doors. I'm going to roll a 20-sided dice
100%.
perception check, or no, I won't bother doing that because that's too random. I'm just going to use my passive perception to find the secret door because I know I'll find all secret doors because I've got higher than a 20. Do you know what I mean? So I think when we as dungeon masters remove or allow the dice to ultimately decide something, and I know I did that initially, when you start realizing, okay, take ownership of it, there's manipulation that needs to take place, a dice roll might be involved. Another thing though is, if people manipulate their environment, right, I don't even worry about passive perception or a dice roll. Like, the manipulation was what was important. They pulled on the right book. It didn't matter that they needed to make a perception check or use passive perception. So I didn't need to even use that at all. And then a lot of people also assume that passive perception, and I felt the same way too, because I thought that's what it was supposed to be until I sort of, again, took ownership of it, is that it's on all the time. It's like radar. Like it's always going. But actually, no. If you look in the book on page 183 of the Player's Handbook, under other activities, it does state that if you are distracted, you don't get to use your passive perception to contribute to the group. So it's not a radar that's always on. So that it doesn't mean you can rely on it all the time, because if you're doing something else, your passive perception may not be coming into play. So there's another aspect to it. And I think, just to sort of wrap things up, since I've been talking a long time, not everybody in the group is going to have a high passive perception. Okay? So that means that there's probably one, if you're really unlucky and somebody's decided in the entire group and they've conspired and they all take the observant feat, then maybe you've got a problem. But if generally there's like one person in the group, or maybe two if you're really unlucky, it's not like their passive perception means that everybody else has got super passive perception. Do you know what I mean? It just means that when you deal with surprise and they shout out, "Oh, there's goblins in the bushes," that doesn't mean that nobody else is surprised because they shouted out. It just means they got to shout out and they're not surprised. Everybody else is surprised and like, "Oh, there is." That's just their part of the mechanic. And so once you start to realize that the effect, because I know a lot of players want that. They want that, I have a high passive perception, so I'm going to warn everybody of everything else so that they benefit from what I've got, so they're never surprised as well. That's not going to happen at my table, because I've done that before and it doesn't work. And frankly, I wouldn't dungeon master that game anymore because I have dungeon mastered that game. So for me, I think now that I understand that I'm not dealing with something that's super easy and simple, and that it actually requires me to use my brain and try to apply real world mechanics into a fantasy world, which is asking an awful lot, frankly, it's my tool. And I frankly think that every dungeon master who uses it, it's your tool. It's not actually the player's tool. It's actually a dungeon master tool. That's me. I'm done.
Well, thank you, Fred. I mean, with the fact of this, like, in comparison to the last two topics we talked about, those are scenario based, like, these are things that might happen. Whereas, like, in 5th edition, passive perception, like you said, because it's in the player's handbook, this is something that pretty much all of us are going to go through at almost immediately, working with players and building their character sheets. They're like, "Oh, what's this?" Well, it's some weird feature that I don't know exactly how to use. So who knows what the heck it is. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Juce. Juce, what have you got to say about high passive perception in our games?
I'm glad I went last. I've thought about how I want to talk about it in so many different ways. Everyone has said some amazing things and have enlightened me on some different ideas. So I want to thank all of you, first of all, for that. So, and I don't know if this is why it was designed this way, but I also hate taking 10 and taking 20. I hated that when I played Pathfinder. I hated when 5e came out and I'd have players that said, "I want to take 20. And I was like, well, first of all, that's not in this game. Second of all, just erase that from your memory. I've always hated that. To me, the auto success that they're going for, I don't like that. Now, I think the reason they have things like passive perception in this game is so that you, especially passive perception rather than taking 20, is because when they were making 5e, they obviously were also trying to appeal to people who played previous editions like AD&D and things like that, right? And one of the things about the older editions, you did have a lot of dungeon crawls, and you always had that player in your group every time there was a door. I want to check for traps. Every single room they went through, I want to check for a secret door. Oh, there's a cabinet. I want to check a drawer. I want to check for a false bottom. So you had constant dice rolling and checks by this one player, usually the rogue. They wanted to check all these things, which slowed the game down, and it slowed it down. And so I think that's why passive perception was put in the game. And being that most of my experiences were with AD&D before 5e, I actually thought passive perception was great when 5e first came out. You might even go back to my old videos and see me saying, wow, I really like this mechanic. Well, I was wrong. It's garbage in my mind. And it's not the concept. It's in my mind, how it works, right? And not even so much by the mechanics so much, but because of the player's perception of how it should work. For years, I've been playing 5e since the day it came out. Didn't have a problem until a few years ago. I had a player that put a lot into passive perception, had a high 20s, mid 20s skill at first level, right? Because we did the human variant feat, all that stuff. And of course, they expect you to tell them everything up front. It doesn't matter what, and even when you try to explain to them that, hey, this is a tool for the DMs, I don't like how this is, I tried having conversations outside of game that I don't like using it the way you want it. They wanted it that way. Offered to say, hey, you can pick a different feat, whatever. To me, it came across very power gamey by a specific player I had the problem with. And that was the issue. And they were a great, I had played with them before and their other characters didn't have this. They were great to play with. It's just this character with this ability was awful. And it made it frustrating as a DM. So, only have had problems with 2 players with this. I've had more players have it, but most players have been understanding of hey, I don't want to give you everything. I, as the DM, do like to surprise players. And it's not with an ambush necessarily. It could be I have a trap. Well, why am I ever going to prep a trap if they expect to always know the trigger? Then you're never going to have traps because there's no point. It just doesn't make sense. Now, I did get smart to twig blights, statues, earth elementals, things like that. And those things work great if you have players like that, but you don't always want to have to find workarounds. It's frustrating. So, again, it's something that maybe the feat really is what makes it the bigger issue. Especially at low levels. Once you get up to higher levels, whatever. But the lower levels, at first level, when difficulties are typically 10, 15, and stuff like that, it's different. Just ultimately, I hate it. I hate it right now. It's just too powerful, at least in the minds of players. And I don't like having those arguments with players. Even when you try to preface it up front, you're always, especially when you play with as many people as me, every once in a while, you're going to have the discussion and they're going to be upset with their character because they took it. And again, I've only had that happen twice in 8 years, but I didn't like the conversation either time. So yeah, I hate it. I really, really hate it. When I saw this question, my response was F you. Sorry. That was my response when I first read it. So, and I've been carrying that with me since the email came through.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've all clearly, to some degree, been victimized by passive perception. And
where does the passive perception touch you on this doll?
Oh God. But I think I've recently come to a good place in my relationship with passive perception. I've, as we all know, it's in the player's handbook. Players have a certain expectation of it. I've changed it. passive perception doesn't mean, this is your player DC that I, for some reason, need to beat. Instead, what I've changed it into is, you've invested in high passive perception. That is now my DC to say, okay, is your passive perception higher than this DC I've set? With your passive perception, you've unlocked the opportunity for me to go make a perception check. It is now a gate to get more perception checks more often, as opposed to me giving you information immediately. You walk into a room. It seems pretty plain. Most of the party's like, this is a bedroom. You, with your high passive perception, I will say, make a perception check. If any of the other players ask, I'll be like, no, because your passive perception isn't high enough. This is now, unfortunately, the way I have to kind of play it, but I'll make sure to include, passive perception DCs that are a bit lower so the other players have a chance to roll something. But it doesn't guarantee that high passive perception player always sees the hidden details, And I will still use it in its stealth sense, like Fred was saying too, like, your character won't be surprised, but that's not necessarily for your good. The rest of the party, they still got to worry about themselves, because if we get rid of ambushes in D&D, like, that is completely, a facet of fantasy storytelling. At some point the party's going to get ambushed because it's fun. Don't always do it, but it's fun at some point, to have that challenge to overcome in a combat scenario.
I think some of my favorite combats were like ambushes on the players too.
Yeah. I agree. It's always the best. Like the tentacle that shoots out of the water when they're all just sitting around and it pulls them towards the water.
Can I ask too, where did the players come up with this idea that the passive perception, just tell me everything that's in there? I just detect that.
I'll tell you where, because I think even Jeremy Crawford tweeted it. It's just like, you can make a perception check, or you can take the thing that's higher. And and if their passive perception is 18 or 20, they're
Crawford.
like, I should know everything.
But and again, the way it's kind of explained is, it's kind of like explained, I think, even in the book, without going to the mechanics. I think it even says it's like your natural awareness of what's going on around you, what you hear and see and stuff, isn't it? Something like that in the book. I know that mechanically.
Because I always felt like it's, again, things like surprise or things like your spidey sense. But I don't know if you go in a room and just look and go, my spidey sense says that in that thing down at the bottom of the floor, there's a tiny, you don't have supervision or something. I mean,
no. So realistically, if you are someone who's ever worked in a restaurant, you know people who have a high passive perception and you know people who don't. The servers that turn into the other people and bump them and stuff, low passive perception. The line cooks who know where the person is with the scalding hot pans next to them and never once run into that, high passive perception.
Yeah, and he's like not even looking at him. He just knows.
Right.
Yeah,
and
you have
certainly
good peripherals, you listen.
Yes.
Like, I'm kind of like that. I've worked in restaurants. I'm always aware. I'm amazed by people who lack awareness of their surroundings.
Yes, and I totally get, and people do have different levels of passive perception, but it turns into this, like we're saying, I should just tell me what's going on, and well, no. I mean, sometimes there are just things you can't detect, and they're like, well, but I have this high thing, And again, I don't use the feet, so it doesn't have as much. You guys, if you're using that feet, I can't imagine. If you've got what Juce is saying, that it turns into a nightmare when someone has something they think is such an advantage.
Yes.
And you're just saying, well, no, that's not how I do it, and because the rules are kind of ambiguous. Anyway, it's just interesting to me that has evolved.
That's where you have to fall back on, like Fred said, and one of the things that I've incorporated is you have to tell them, don't look at your passive perception score on your character sheet. That is a tool for me. It is not yours. That's mine. That little section, the passive perception, investigation, whatever else is written there, that's the Dungeon Master tool. That is not the player's tool.
But aren't they assuming that, okay, then you're back there rolling and I've got a 28, so how could you have beaten
That's
that
when
if
you throw them a bone. You say, hey,
Yeah.
with your passive perception, you notice that waitress winked at you.
Yes.
Or you notice that waiter is like putting some coins in a purse that he shouldn't be doing.
Wally, so since you've taken ownership of this and the way you've kind of explained it, you still do not have players that'll go, oh, by the way, my passive perception is this. Like, you never have them do that stuff?
Absolutely I do. And
that's
my
the
brother's
thing.
doing that. And he'll do that every time. He's just like, I'll explain everything. He's just, and something will happen. He's just like, I should have seen that in my passive perception. I was like, that is a tool for me. Passive perception is mine. That's not yours. Or I'll have him make an active passive perception check. A roll of 10. And just like, yeah, but my passive perception 15. I was like, Jason, that is for me. That's a DM tool. And I just have to, I just take a quick 5 seconds of game time to be like, that's my tool that I use. That's, that's not your tool. That's not what I use that for. And it's getting less and less, but it's.
How long have you been playing with this high passive perception player?
This is my brother. We've been playing for years, but with this incident in particular, 5 sessions.
Okay, that's fair. I might be able to handle it for 5 sessions.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably a learned thing to be done in more than 5 sessions.
This is our classic example of we just get together to have a good time. This is a family game, and just the fact that we're getting together is a miracle. I mean,
That's awesome.
I absolutely love it. It's amazing. So, but yeah.
And I mean, other ways, like, even though, like Juce said, like, it's not exactly fun to find the workarounds mechanically, but let me save you some time, Like, keep track of travel pace. If they're traveling fast, -5 to passive perception. If they have disadvantage on perception checks,
Dim light.
-5 to passive perception. That 23 suddenly 18. You actually stand a chance to have something with a DC 20. You can only do this one time. One encounter where all the enemies have invisibility for some reason. Disadvantage on perception checks, advantage on stealth checks. -18 or 18 on the passive perception. You can't overuse these things, unfortunately, but there's a few methods. But
I
yeah.
like the ideas that you guys have come up with this, but I still feel unconvinced at the end of the day to use passive perception in lieu of just
I've been there.
reworking the old school kind of,
Jacob,
thought
so
would
you
come
don't
from.
allow it, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
So do you
I
have
read-
the players that roll in every room for the secret doors and the traps and all that stuff?
way I handle it is if you want to find a secret room, you find the secret room.
But you don't have players that like spam the perception roll?
I've had some people try, but I've made it pretty clear that if you want to find what's here in the room, touch things, move things around, find out what happens.
Good.
You're
Good for
gonna,
you, Jacob.
I'm even, it took me a long time to be okay with this, but I've been okay with people not finding the secret room or not
Sure.
finding the invisible stalker that's in the room and then it jumps them on the way out.
You know what? That sounds like a cultural shift you're introducing there, Jacob.
If you don't mind, Denny, there's like 3 points that I wrote down that I wouldn't mind touching on real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
The first one is traps. Being that I have a YouTube channel that's focused on puzzles and traps, I'm actually working on a trap book too. And I hope to do with this book, but I think it's doing already, is the definition of traps is changing. So if you have, if you're DMing a game and you have a player that thinks they should be able to detect traps just with a perception check, you've really got to be specific, because traps just aren't holes in the wall or statues that breathe fire or a pit trap beneath your feet.
Traps should be just as complicated as enemies.
Yeah, and if you've seen my channel at all, I mean, I've got a cat locked in a box that's a trap. I've got all these different things that I mean, seriously, everything can be a trap if you place it correctly. So if you have characters that are wanting to use their perception to detect traps, they're going to need to move into Jacob's type of field there, and they're going to, and Fred as well, and they're going to have to explain to you exactly what are you doing to detect these traps, and go that way. The second thing is, Denny, I really like what you're doing with the perception, only allowing those that have that high perception. So you set the bar, maybe a passive perception 18 or higher. Anybody with that can roll a perception or higher. It really reminds me of when you used to only be able to roll if you're proficient in a skill, which I think would also be a way to do that too. I mean, you could, if you're proficient with perception, then you can make a roll. And that's very much, I like your workaround a little bit better, because that just sets the bar and you don't even have to worry about anybody being proficient or whatnot. Just like that passive perception person gets to roll because it's 15 or higher. And then the last thing is I appreciate this discussion because there are some topics that are so gray that they can be discussed for hours and hours and hours and hours, and everybody's still going to come out with their own opinions, their own thoughts on this. But what this DM roundtable did here tonight with passive perception gave me a lot of ideas, and I think that's why we need to continue discussing. Passive perception has been beaten to damn ground. It really has. I've seen so many videos on it. I've read so many blogs on it. Yet I still come here tonight with a few of my YouTube friends, and I still learn something. And that's why we need to keep, as DMs, discussing these and sharing ideas. And don't be closed-minded. Just because it's something you do one thing one way, be like, yeah, but that idea that Jacob had, or that idea that Fred or Juice or Kevin or Denny had, that makes sense. I might try to incorporate it and give it a try. And that's why I love these discussions. So thank you very much for the question.
Aw, thanks, Wally. That means a lot.
Yeah, that's so awesome.
Well, before we
you
move
get in
on,
the video here.
yeah, thank you all. I assume we've beaten this horse enough. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us on a conversation about passive perception. I noticed we had some people in the chat being like, oh, my poor passive perception, I'm not going to notice things now. And it's like, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
too bad.
It's got to be fun for everybody, you know? Like, you build your character a certain way, and I totally get that. But also, fun for the table, fun for the DM too, right? And that's a wrap on this discussion of high passive perception. If you've been enjoying these Dungeon Master Roundtables, perhaps subscribe to the channel here and hit that bell. And also, be sure to check out all the channels of the guests who were present during this video as well. You can find the links to their channels down in the description below. And until next time, may you always play Dicely.